The goal of this video is to walk you through the step-by-step instructions aligned with building out our basic version of the LeaveRequest application. We have broken this tutorial down into 4 parts that consist of Part 1, where we will build out the data component by utilizing K2's SmartBox Smart Object technology for storing form content. Part 2 will take us through building the form and views necessary to capture leave requests from our users. In Part 3, we will focus on building the leave request approval workflow component. Then, in the same section, we will edit the form so that it integrates with the workflow. Finally, in Part 4, we will test our application to ensure that it works. Beginning here with Part 1, we will create a SmartBox Smart Object. However, the first task before we get into creating our leave request application is to prepare K2 Designer. We'll do this by adding categories in the K2 category tree. Categories will house our forms, views, and workflow in an organizational layout. You can actually think of them as folders inside the K2 environment, which are similar to the folders in Windows Explorer. While this step is not necessary, it is a good practice to keep your K2 artifacts organized, especially as you begin to build larger applications. There may be a shortcut on your desktop, but let's get started by opening up the K2 Designer tool from the Start button. You can go down to Start, then select All Programs, K2 Black Pearl, K2 Smart Forms, and then K2 Designer. Now, this may take a few seconds to open if you haven't hit the website yet on your machine. On the left side of the screen is the category browser. This is where your K2 artifacts, mainly forms, views, and workflows, will be stored and accessed. The All Items category is the primary category for storing applications that you will build. First, we are going to create a main category for all our applications called K2 Learning under the All Items category. As you work through all the K2 tutorials, you can create new categories under the K2 Learning category to keep your files organized. Let's right-click All Items and select New Category. You can name the new category K2 Learning and then click OK. When you're ready, then under K2 Learning, let's create another category structure for the leave request application following the same steps. Right-click on K2 Learning, and then select New Category again. And here we want to enter in Leave Request. You can click OK when you're ready. Now let's add 3 more categories under Leave Request, and we'll call the first one Forms. And the next one we can call Smart Objects. And then finally add Views, as shown here. These categories will hold our form, smart object, and views accordingly. Now, at this point, your category structure should look like mine here. With the forms, smart objects, and views categories, we will have a nice bit of organization for our project going forward. Moving on to step 2, we will create the only smart object required for this application. The leave request application we are building in this tutorial will not be connecting to any existing data sources or SharePoint lists, so we will need to create our own. We can do this using K2's SmartBox Smart Object technology, which will create a table in the K2 SQL database automatically for us. This does allow us to manually create the columns we need based on our data requirements, and K2 will automatically handle the setup of methods like create, getList, and save. These methods will be used later on when we design the smart form and views. We can create a smart object in a category in a similar fashion to how we created the actual categories themselves. You should still have K2 Designer open with the categories opened up to the leave request group at this point. So right-click on the Smart Object category, and then select New Smart Object from the context menu that appears. This is going to automatically put the smart object in this category when we save it. Now, if you end up on the Smart Objects introduction screen, you can click Next to move on to the General Settings screen. And then give the smart object the name Leave Request Smart Object. You can leave the category setting alone as it is defaulted to where we just right-clicked. Now, because smart objects can be created in a couple other places, this wizard setting is always going to be available here on this page to change categories if you actually do have the need. Make sure that type is set to Smart Object, as this is the option that creates a Smart Object using the K2 SmartBox service. And then ensure there is a check in the box to allow this Smart Object to be used in workflows. This will expose the Smart Object and its properties to workflows as they are built in K2 Workflow Designer. You will get to see how that works in part 3 of this tutorial. You can click Next when you're ready to move on, and then we'll define the properties or columns of this Smart Object. You'll notice here on the Define Properties screen, K2 has already defined the ID property, which will be the key identifier or primary key basically for each record in the Smart Object. Let's begin by adding the rest of the properties for the Leave Request Smart Object now. Typical Leave Request records need a title, a leave type, and start and end dates for the basic columns. Begin by clicking Add, and then enter in Leave Request Title for the first property, then select Text as its type. That's good for the title property. We won't need to set key, required, or unique for any of the properties in this tutorial. When you're ready, click on Add Property or the Add button at the top here within this window to set up the next property. Next, we'll enter in employee name and then select text for its type, and then click Add again and enter in employee email and select text. Following the same procedure, we want to put the start and end dates for the leave request in now. Enter in leave start date for the next one and select date. And then do that again for leave end date and select date as well for that one. When you're ready, click Add and then name this one leave type and set it to text. We will actually hook this up to a drop-down list on the form later on, so you'll get to see how that's done. Enter in another one called Requester Comments and set it as a memo. This will give the requester the ability to add more information to the form if necessary. Then to finish up, add one more field in called Request Status and set it to text. This field will end up being reserved for the workflow to update so that it can provide feedback to users about the status of their request. We'll see how that works later on when we get to building out the leave request workflow. Click OK to close out the Add Properties window now. Then click Next and then Finish. Associations are beyond the scope of this tutorial for the Smart Object. Therefore, we don't need to do anything on the Associations page. That's it for step 2. Just to quickly review this step, at this point you've created your first K2 SmartBox Smart Object. When you look closer at the Smart Object properties, you should recognize them as the future form fields we will use for our leave request form. When users submit their leave requests going forward, the form content will be saved to this Smart Object data source. Then as the workflow progresses, the request status property will be updated with the appropriate status value. In part 2, we will focus on building the form needed for our leave request application. Now that we have our Smart Object created, we can tell K2 to automatically design a view based off of that Smart Object. K2 has the ability to create the view and assign the Smart Object properties to entry controls like text boxes, which you can then move around and edit as needed. In step 3, we will create an item view for new leave requests, with the design in mind for it to contain the content of a single record. This view will become the focal point of our leave request entry form, and when submitted, will create one record for storage in the leave request Smart Object. We generated our Smart Object in the previous section of this tutorial, and now that we have it, we can actually tell K2 to automatically design views and forms based off of that Smart Object. This is helpful in speeding up our form design time. The first view we will create is an item view, which is a view that will contain the content for a single record and allow us to enter new or edit existing records from the Smart Object. I'm assuming at this point that you still have K2 Designer available with the categories opened up to the leave request group that we just created. To generate our first view, you can open up the Smart Object category to expose the leave request Smart Object if it isn't already visible. Then you can right-click on the Smart Object to open the context menu up. We can perform various actions here on the Smart Object like edit, delete, rename, or even move it to another category. In this task, we want to design a view, so you can go ahead and select Design View, And then when the introduction screen opens up, click on Next to move to the General Settings window. This window lets you give the view a name, description, assign a category if necessary, set the view type, and even change the data source if you want. Here, let's name this view Leave Request Item View, and then change the category to the Leave Request Views category. You can do this by clicking on the ellipses button next to the category box, then select Views when the Select a Category window opens up, and click OK when you're done. Then be sure that the item view is selected as the view type. We'll get to the list view option in a future step. You don't need to change the data source, so leave that setting alone and click Next to move on. Now we're looking at the Layout Design window. On this window, you can select Create Labels and Controls. By doing this, K2 will pop open a window with options to select the fields we want to see on our view, along with a few other settings like setting the number of table columns, label positioning options, and the option to configure buttons tied to the Smart Object methods. On this window, leave the number of columns set to 2. This will line up in a style with labels in the left column and entry controls in the right column. We'll see this in a minute when we finish generating the form. Next, we want to include all fields on the form except the ID. This field is handled by the system, so users do not need to really see it or edit it. So select Include All Fields to make this easy, then uncheck the Include box next to ID. We want the employee email field set to Display Only, and then change the label position to left and turn on the colon suffix. Moving down into the Methods section, put a check in the Standard box for Create. This will add a button to the view to create the Leave Request item when the button is clicked. You can then click OK to generate the view when you're ready. Okay, at this point in the lesson, your screen should look like mine. Notice here we have labels positioned on the left with a colon suffix as we selected earlier in the Create Labels and Controls window. And we have Edit Controls in the right table column and a Create button down here at the bottom. We'll move on now to edit more of the layout and properties for this view, but just to keep you on the same page with me, be aware of the following sections and items on this window. The breadcrumb bar here at the top will allow us to edit more areas of this view, such as parameters and rules. The design canvas is the main view itself, and it's provided by the Layout tab menu option and can be updated based on what you want your users to see. You can drop more fields and controls on the design canvas from the toolbox section here on the right, and the properties pane down here lets you set properties of controls and the view when selected in the design canvas. Also notice the rules tab here. This lets you add a rule directly to a selected item in the design canvas like a button or a text box. When you need to move around to different sections from the breadcrumb bar in this editor, you can also select Back or Next. This navigation menu is just another way to move around, finish, save, get help information, or cancel out of the editor. Let's look at the design now. Notice the employee email data label that appears here as a static control. When we set the email column to be display only, K2 threw in a data label for the field because it is uneditable. However, it is dynamic in nature, which we will use to our advantage a bit later on when we set it to reflect the email address of the currently logged on user. One other trick you can perform with data labels is the ability to hide them on the form and actually embed code such as JavaScript for their value. We won't do this here, but it does give you more functionality in the view if needed. Let's make a few more customizations to this view to make it flow a little better. We need to adjust the width of the entire label column and then change the width of the two date fields themselves. You can manage this by hovering over the center column line until you see the double lines or arrows. Then click and drag the column line so that it is closer in proximity to your labels. For the date fields, highlight the Leave Start Date Calendar box by selecting it, and then down in the Properties pane, change the width to 50%. It's that simple. Now repeat this same step for the Leave End Date Calendar box. Another thing I'd like to fix is the leave type box. We are only allowing certain kinds of leave types to be entered. Therefore, we can change the leave type control to a drop-down list and add some choices for our users to select. This will keep the leave types consistent as they are saved back to the SmartBox Smart Object. K2 gives us an easy way to do this right here on the design canvas, so I'll show you. Highlight the leave type text box, and then select the Change Control icon found in the View menu at the top of the page. Here you can change the control to a drop-down list by selecting this item from the available options here in the list. Make a note of the other options available. These may be different for other types of controls as you want to change them. We can hook this drop-down list to an external data source if we want to, but in this tutorial we will just add the values manually for now. With the leave type control still highlighted, open the data source type editor found in the Properties pane in the lower right side of the page. I'll show you where that is. Then select the option to use a static list of values in the control. Open the list editor here and add the following options for both the value and the display. The first option will enter in paid time off, and then the second option will set as study leave, and the third option will set as family responsibility. You can click OK when you're finished. Now let's change the width of the leave type list control to 50%, just like we did with the end date and start date over in the Properties settings. We have one last adjustment to make to this view layout. Let's go ahead and move the Create button to the lower right side of the view. All you have to do here is click and drag the Create button into the second cell column of the table. Then click within the cell itself to highlight it and select the right align icon found in the View Canvas menu at the top of the page. With that completed, your view should now look like mine with the widths and the button looking much better. You can click Finish in the navigation wizard now to save and exit from this view. Let's do a quick review. In this step, we created an item view based on the Leave Request Smart Object. By designing the view directly from the Smart Object, K2 automatically created the view fields and display layout. We selected the Create button for our view to handle leave request record creation, and K2 creates all of the necessary rules and actions so that when the Create button is clicked, a new SmartBox Smart Object record is created in the associated Leave Request Smart Object. We also applied some minor formatting and we manually entered the values for our leave type drop-down list. In step 4, we are going to create a list view, which gives us the ability to display the content from multiple records in a list. We will use this view to output all of the previous leave requests for the currently logged in user, or, when approving a leave request, for the user who submitted the request. Using the view configured this way will be especially helpful to the approving manager to assess how much leave this employee has requested. Again, back in K2 Designer, go to the Smart Object category for the Leave Request application, and right-click the Leave Request Smart Object, and then select Design View. If you come up to the introduction screen again, you can go ahead and just click Next. Now, let's name the new view Leave Request List View. Then you'll want to make sure to move it to the Views category like we did in the previous view. We don't want it to drop into the Smart Object category here. Now you can change the view type to List View this time, and uncheck the option to call this method when the form loads. We want to uncheck this option because we have designed this list view based off of a Smart Object. K2 by default will retrieve all content from the Smart Object when the view is loaded, and this is not what we want for performance and optimization reasons. We only want the records that pertain to the current user, not all of the records, which is why we turn this off. In a later step, we will configure an action to retrieve any records for the current user only based off of a filtering type rule. You can click Next when you're ready. Now select the Create Labels and Controls option, and then on the layout screen, we want to include the following fields: Leave Request Title, Employee Name, Leave Start Date, Leave End Date, Leave Type, and Request Status. There are no other changes to the layout editor from this standpoint, so you can click OK when you're ready. And that's it, so click Finish to save and exit from this view. Let's touch on what we just did here for a quick review. In this step, we created a basic list view based off of the Leave Request Smart Object. We will use this view to retrieve previous leave request records for the current user. Make a note that using a list view can also be helpful in master detail or header line item type views, where you want to show, for example, a list of sales orders for a product type or a salesperson. We won't get into this for the leave request scenario, but you can also use list views in reporting scenarios with aggregate functions that show things like totals and averages. If you recall back when we went through the design of this application, a form is the main container for views and additional controls. For step 5, we will create the leave request form and then add in our 2 views that we just created. We will then apply a new theme showing you how to change its look and feel. With K2 Designer open, right-click the Forms category now and select New Form. There's nothing here to do on the Forms introduction screen, so you can click Next. And now name the new form Leave Request Form. The category should be okay in this instance, so you can click Next. You should now be on the Form Designer screen, and similar to the View Designer, the Form Designer has a design canvas and many of the same toolbars and panes with the same functionality. To drop a view onto the form, locate the view Leave Request Item View in the Category section here on the left, and drag it onto the Form Design canvas with your mouse. With the view on the canvas now, notice that it says in parentheses in the upper left of the view, Enter View Title. Let's give the view a name for appearance, so you can double-click on the words Enter View Title and change it to Leave Request. Now let's add the list view below the item view, so drag the Leave Request list view down under the item view, and you should notice that K2 automatically adds a new placeholder as you drag the view onto the canvas. You can go ahead and drop the view into that placeholder. Double-click the Enter View Title for this one, and change it to Previous Leave Requests. Okay, at this point the form looks pretty good, so let's move on and give it some styling by changing the theme settings. The last step in creating our form will be to customize the look and feel by changing the default theme to the Lithium theme. Now make a note, K2 has a number of predefined themes here that you can apply to your forms, or you can create your own themes as you advance in your K2 knowledge. Lithium happens to be K2's latest theme as of this recording, and it is a theme that can actually be applied to mobile-enabled forms and settings. First, we need to expose the Properties pane for the form, so click anywhere in the areas outside of the views as I'll demonstrate here. Then down in the Properties pane, navigate to the Theme property found under the Appearance heading. You should be able to find and select the Lithium option here. If you are having trouble seeing the theme property, it's quite possible that a view is highlighted, so make sure that you've clicked somewhere on the structure of the form outside of the views. Now notice the Lithium theme as it is applied to the form. You can go ahead and click Finish to save and exit the Form Designer. Remember, views and forms are not going to be available to your users until you have checked them in. This essentially publishes the artifacts to the K2 server. Once the views and forms are checked in, if you do want to go back and make a change to one of them, you must check it out first, make your changes, and then check it back in before those changes are evident to your users. So from here, go back over to the category browser, right-click the Leave Request form, and select Check In. If you happen to get a message about associated views, just click OK to continue. Let's do a quick recap for this section. In this step, we created a new form and then added our item view and list view to the form canvas. Because we generated the Create button on the item view, we do not have to add a Submit button. Finally, we gave our form a complete makeover also by simply changing the theme to the mobile-friendly Lithium option. In Part 3, we will create the Leave Request workflow. Steps 6 through 11 will involve creating the workflow with user and system tasks, incorporating the data and forms components created in Parts 1 and 2, and deploying the workflow back to K2. The workflow will contain one user task, which handles the manager making a decision on the request, and it will also contain various system tasks to update the status property in the Leave Request Smart Object. Let's move on over to Step 6 now, where we will create a new workflow using K2 Designer. associate the workflow with the leave request form, and then assign workflow rights to users. To get started with the workflow design, we need to first create a new category under leave request and name it workflows. We did this earlier with the forms, smart objects, and views categories, so you can do that really quickly now. Now let's create the workflow itself by right-clicking the New Workflows category, and then from the context menu select New Workflow. The workflow settings screen should open up at this point. On this screen, you can go ahead and name the workflow Leave Request Workflow. Because we have a custom smart form already created for use in this workflow, we need to associate the form with the workflow's start event. We can do this by clicking the ellipses to the right of the form field to open up a dialog. Then in this dialog window, navigate to and select the Leave Request form. You can click OK when you're ready. Now that we have the form associated with the workflow, the next task is to populate the folio field, which is used to identify, distinguish, and give title to running instances of workflows for reports and users. We can assign any values we want to this field, but in the case of our scenario, we'll use the value entered into the Leave Request title text box, which is available here in the context browser to the right. To get to it, you can expand the Smart Forms tree in the context browser, down to the Leave Request item view, open the controls group, and then drag the Leave Request title text box control into the folio field as I demonstrate here on my screen. For a brief bit of detail, I will say that folios are typically made up of a combination of plain text and/or fields from your application's data source, such as the customer name or an order number and a start date. You can also use the folio as a variable throughout your workflow. For example, you might append the folio to the subject line or a line within the body of an email message. For the sake of time, I won't go into too much more detail about the folio field here, but if you would like to learn more, feel free to reference the training documentation for this section in the course where you will find a detailed explanation. You can go ahead and click Next when you're ready. You should now be on the Configure the Rule to Start the Workflow screen. Here, we want to tell K2 that we want to start the workflow when the Create button has been clicked. Confirm that the Select Rule dropdown contains the value on Leave Request Item View when the Create button is clicked. You can click Next when your settings match the rule on my screen. We will not need to set any data field settings on this next step, so feel free to click Finish. At this point, we have configured the basic settings for our Leave Request workflow. However, our users don't have access to start or approve a workflow when it runs. We still need to assign permissions, and to do that, we need to access the Advanced Workflow settings. You can double-click the Start button to open the Advanced Workflow Settings wizard. This is actually the same wizard we just worked through. By going into the advanced version this way, you can access the permissions settings. So from the first window, you can click through on the Next button until you reach the Workflow Rights screen. Here we can start by changing the Search Scope drop-down from People to Groups. Then search on the words Domain Users by entering that text into the search box. You can click the search icon or hit Enter at this point. Now you should see the Domain Users group in the search results pane. You can drag and drop the Domain Users group into the Permissions pane, and then put a check in the Start and View boxes for that group. If you do not assign permissions, your users will see an error when they submit the form. The Start setting allows users to start the workflow, and the View setting allows users to view the workflow reporting information. Click Finish when your permissions match my screen. Now that we have our workflow settings complete, we can move on to adding steps to the workflow. The first event we are going to add will be a system event using the Smart Object Event wizard. Here, let's set the request status property to indicate the leave request has been submitted back in the data source. I'll show you how to get to the data source Smart Object methods. Select the Smart Objects tab in the Workflow ribbon at the top of the page. Then you can drag the Save Leave Request event into the empty slot on the Workflow design canvas. This is the same as Update for this data source. The Save Leave Request Smart Object wizard screen will open up. The first configuration we need to make is to tell K2 which record that we want to update. We do this by passing the Smart Object ID input value for the current record into the save event. This is convenient because at runtime, the workflow will have a reference to that ID because it will be the record that actually started the workflow. From the context browser, expand the Item References node, then drill into the Leave Request Smart Object. Here we want to drag the Smart Object ID into the ID input property over here on the left. Now we'll set the status accordingly. You may need to scroll down until you see the request status input here, but go ahead and enter the word submitted into the value field. Click Next and then click Finish to complete the save event configuration. Let's do a little work here to keep our workspace organized. To promote this practice, we want to rename the status save event so that we know exactly what it's doing. Double-click the Save Leave Request event title and rename it or change it to Set Status Submitted. When you do this, you will have a better understanding of the view flow and workflow statistical reporting based on events in your workflows as they fire. At this point, let's do a review of what we've just done. In this step, we created the Leave Request workflow and configured it to use the Leave Request form. We assigned workflow rights or permissions to all domain users so that they can start the workflow and view workflow progress. We also added a Smart Object Save event which will update the status property to indicate the form has been submitted. With Step 7, we will add the Manager Approval user task to the workflow, which will be the approval decision assigned to the workflow originator's manager. Before we can add new events to the canvas, we need to add an empty event slot for the next event in line with our workflow. Hover over the Set Status Submitted event until you can see the workflow step outcome icon. This is going to look like a little blue mini flowchart in one of the corners. Click the outcome icon to open the wizard. Now on the configuration screen, you can click the Add button, replace the text New Outcome with the word Continue, and then click OK. Notice that K2 has added an empty event box to the design canvas. Using the ribbon menu at the top of the page, let's switch back to the Workflow Steps tab, then drag a User Task Smart Forms event into the new event box. When the User Task wizard opens, you can name the task Manager Approval. Being a user task assignment step, we also need to create actions for our managers to take with their assigned tasks for leave requests. Remember from the workflow design that our requirements for this application are just going to be approved and rejected as options for managers to take. We can use this screen to configure these actions. Actions are the decisions or options that the user assigned the task can make to complete a task. The minimum number of actions for a user task is at least one, and you are able to have many here. Let's enter the following actions: approved and rejected, put them on separate lines, and click Next when you're ready. The user form setting can be left alone for now, so we can click Next, and the work item rule is fine, so click Next again. The next task to complete is figuring out how to assign this task to the workflow originator's manager. We can do this on the participant screen right here. Drag the manager name from the right into the task group window. K2 provides two favorites here by default, one for the originator of the workflow and the other is the originator's manager. You also have the option to search for other participants within your organization with the search box. It can also locate groups for task assignment if your requirements dictate the need. We also want to send an email notification to the manager when a task is assigned. Therefore, be sure to put a check in the box to notify participants when they receive a work item. One quick note, if you are building this application within your own environment, you may want to actually assign the task participant to a user where you have access to their Outlook email client. If you do not have that type of access, then you might consider assigning this task to yourself for testing purposes. If you are building this application on a K2 provided VM, you will have access to the manager's Outlook for all of the users on that VM. To save time, we will not customize the task notification email for this application in this tutorial, so you can click Finish. Your screen should now have the Set Status event, followed by the user task for manager approval. Because we created two actions for the manager to take, the workflow now has the ability to do work when the manager approves or rejects the leave request. Before we move on, let's get in the habit of saving our work in the design canvas. You can do this by selecting File from the menu at the top of the page, and then within that menu, select Save. Let's do a quick review. In Step 7, we added a user task and assigned it to the Workflow Originator's manager. We added two actions, one being approved and the other being rejected. K2 automatically generated the outcome lines for each of these actions that we added to the user task. Now remember, we can have many actions here, but we need to have at least one for it to work. By checking the option to notify the participant of a work list item, the manager will receive an email indicating that they have a task. This email will have a link to open the form and action the task. Step 8 continues the workflow with the addition of two system tasks that will update the request status property in the Leave Request Smart Object. This will be depending on the decision made by the approving manager. K2 Designer makes reusing events very simple by allowing you to copy and paste existing events, which is what we will do in this step to speed up our design experience. This step will complete the Smart Object events for the workflow. Let's go back to the workflow design canvas now. As I mentioned, K2 gives us the ability to copy and paste events to promote reuse and speed up our design experience. Follow my lead here as I demonstrate how to copy the Set Status Approved event. You can left click and drag a box over the Set Status Submitted event to highlight it, then lift up on the mouse button. At this point, you should notice a context menu appear with some options like copy, cut, delete, and save as a template. We won't go into all of these right now, so just select copy when you see the menu open up. You can now paste this copied event into an empty event slot anywhere on the design canvas. We can start with the approved path event. So hover over the approved outcome event, right click, and then select paste. Now, before we configure that event, move down to the rejected path and hover over the rejected outcome event, right-click, and click Paste once again. When you're done with that, you should notice that K2 copied the Save event as well as the Continue Outcome line. In the next few steps, we will adjust each new event so that they are consistent with their outcome. Then we will add a placeholder event to the last two empty event boxes. A placeholder will simply complete an outcome line without adding a formal event. Make a note, you can't deploy a workflow to a K2 environment with empty event slots on the design canvas. Placeholders will allow you to deploy and test your workflow without receiving errors of missing events. We'll get to that in a moment. Let's double-click inside of the Set Status Submitted 1 event, which is on the approval side, to open up its wizard. Change the name to Set Status Approved, and then click Next. Let's take a moment to edit the Continue 1 outcome so that it actually says Continue. Select Continue 1, change the text accordingly, and you can click Next. This event came from our Submit Status event, so on the Input Properties screen, you're going to need to change the Request Status property input from Submitted to Approved. You may have to scroll down to find it. Be sure to keep the ID property as it is, since we have already configured it to reflect the current record. You could go ahead and click Finish when you're ready. Repeat the steps we just completed for the rejected side. We can rename the event to Set Status Rejected, click Next, then edit the outcome, and we'll have it say Continue as well. Click Next, then find the request status input here and change it to Rejected. Then click Finish. We're still on the design canvas at this point, so from the ribbon menu at the top of the page, drag a placeholder event into each of the empty event boxes, one for the approved side and the other for the rejected. And that's easy enough. When you're ready, go ahead and select File from the menu at the top of the page and click Save to save your work. Let's do another quick review. In this step, we reuse the Save event for the approved and rejected outcomes. By copying and pasting the event, we could take advantage of configurations already in place. We just needed to make sure that the ID property was still used. Copying an event will also copy its associated outcome, so we added placeholders into each of the new event boxes that were created. We cannot deploy or test our application with empty event boxes, so the placeholders will tell K2 that the event boxes are empty by design. Next, we will use step 9 to deploy the workflow. Deploying the workflow from a high level publishes the workflow to the K2 server, which then allows it to be exposed to the forms configured for that workflow. If you make changes to your workflow, you must redeploy it before the changes are published to the K2 server. And remember, upon deployment, your currently running workflow instances will always run under the version of the workflow that they started against. Go back to your workflow design canvas if you don't have it available already. We can deploy the workflow by clicking the File menu option from the menu at the top of the page, and then select Deploy. Let's talk about what's happening while this is running. You should see the deploying workflow dialog while the workflow is being compiled and deployed. The workflow itself is checked for issues, then the designer sends it on to the K2 server. This can take a bit of time if it's the first workflow you've deployed for the day. I'm going to go ahead and pause the video here for the sake of time. Okay, when you see the deployment successful dialog, your workflow is deployed and ready for use. You can click Close and exit from here, where we can move on to Step 10. In Step 10, we will edit the form initializing rule to display the current user's leave requests in the list view that we created earlier. To get this to work, we will add an action that retrieves the current user's previous leave requests found in the Leave Request Smart Object. We will also take a moment to configure K2 to automatically populate the employee name and the employee email fields on the form with the current user's details. Great, now that the workflow has been deployed, we can go back into our forms and tweak them based on where in the workflow the form is being used. Think of this as the state of the form. For example, when the form is used in the manager approval step, we really want to load the previous leave requests in the context of the user who actually requested the leave, and not the manager's leave requests. When the form is used to start the workflow, we want to populate the previous leave request list with the current logged in user's requests, and also set a couple of other controls on the form with the current user's information. To make this happen, we have to edit rules for the form to behave differently for a workflow start state and a workflow user task state. I'll show you how to do this now. Go back to K2 Designer, click on the Leave Request form, and select Edit. Once the form loads up, you can move over to the Rules section by clicking the Rules option in the breadcrumb bar here at the top of the screen. From here, we can highlight the Leave Request Workflow default state, and then over here on the right, select when the form is initializing, and then click Edit to edit that rule. Oh yeah, remember you may need to check this form out again before you can make edits to it. If you do see this window, go ahead and click Yes here, and go back up to the menu and select Edit Rule once again. First, we want to populate the Leave Requests list view. Recall that this is the view that we created to output a list of all leave requests previously submitted for the requester. To do this, we want to execute or call a Smart Object method called getList for the list view. From the Rule Designer Actions pane here on the left, click once on the action called Execute a View method to add it to the rule definition pane here on the right side. Now, to configure this method call, we need to tell this action which view has the method that we want. Click the link called Select View, then in here select Leave Request List View. Next, we need to tell it which method to call. You can click on the Select Method link and choose getList. The getList method will retrieve content from the data source, which in this example is the smart object that we created for this application. Let's configure the inputs for this method now. You can click the Configure link, which will take us to where we can plug in parameters for the getList method and then filter the list results accordingly. There are two places that we are primarily concerned with when this editor opens for this task. First, we need to tell K2 which user's records that we want. In other words, we need to plug in the input values for the method. And then second, we need to tell K2 which smart object properties we actually want to return. These are going to be the output values. Open the mapping destination for the Leave Request List view down to the Get List Input Properties group for the Leave Request Smart Object. Then expand the System Values and Current User option from the context browser on the right and drag the Current User email property into the Get List Input property for Employee Email. Here, we are basically telling K2 to use the current user's email as the filter to search for previous leave requests. Now click the Output Mappings button from the menu options at the top of the screen. Here we want to tell K2 which properties that we want returned for our form. Follow my lead again here to drag the highlighted return properties into the Leave Request List View fields. You may actually have to collapse the item view in order to see this list view. Now match up the fields with the return properties as follows: Leave Request Title, Employee Name, Leave Start Date, Leave End Date, Leave Type, and finally Request Status. Then you can close this out when you're ready. Now we want to go back and display the current user's name and email on the Leave Request item view. K2 will automatically populate these fields based on who is logged in when we're done with this task. These values will then be saved to the Leave Request Smart Object when the form is submitted, along with the Leave Request details. This step is simply a matter of transferring system values to the item view fields. Let's do this right now. So while still in the Rule Designer, on the Actions tab, search on the keyword Transfer, then click on Transfer Data to add it to the rule definition pane here on the right. Let's tell K2 which fields we want to transfer at this point. You can click the Configure link for this new action. Then, in the context browser, you can expand the System Values node, open it up down to the current user, drag the display name into the employee name text box field, then drag the email context field into the employee email data label field. Click OK when your page looks like mine. Finally, your rule definition pane should now look like this, and notice that the two actions we just added are showing up under the Complete the Following One After Another processing statement. Click OK to close the Rule Designer. Let's run through a review for Step 10. In this step, we edited the form initializing rule on the Leave Request workflow default state, so that the current user's previous leave requests will populate the Leave Request list view when the form loads in the time or state of capturing a new leave request. We also configured the system values for the display name and email to populate their corresponding fields on the item view. In our final build step of Step 11, we will edit a rule so that the approving manager sees the originator's leave requests on the form. This will require adding a rule to populate leave request details on the manager approval state for the form. We will also do one more thing on this form. We are going to hide the Create button, since the approving manager doesn't need to create a record during the approval step of the workflow. Let me begin with a quick note about handling the workflow approval and task action capability for managers in our form. At runtime, K2 will automatically add a third view to the form for the approving manager, which will contain our actions for approved and rejected and a submit button for this stage of the workflow. Because K2 can automatically configure this, we do not have to build this in manually, although it is possible to customize this if you have a requirement to do so. Continuing on with roles for the form, let's select the workflow task state now. We're doing this because we want to edit the rule called when the form is initializing for this particular state and not either of the other states listed. Then select Edit Rule to open up the Rule Designer. As a reminder, states are used to control the behavior of a form based on how it is being used. In the previous step, we edited the Leave Request Workflow default state, which represents the point at the very beginning of the workflow, or the point where an employee creates a leave request. We edited the Form Initialize rule here because we wanted to configure the user interface at the very beginning of the process. Now we want to configure the user interface for the approving manager when they open the form for the approval user task assignment. In our application, this is called the workflow task state. First, we want to configure an action so that the originator's previous leave requests are loaded for the manager to review. Then we will hide the Create button for the manager as it is not needed. Click on Execute a View method to add it to the rule definition pane on the right. Then click the Select View link and choose the Leave Request List View. Then you can click the Select Method link and choose Get List. With Get List as our method, you can click the Configure link here. Similar to Step 10, we will map the input properties and the return properties for the Get List method. But instead of using the system value for the email input, we will use the Smart Objects value for the employee email input property because it will have the email address for the employee that entered the leave request instead of the manager's email address. Over in the context browser, you can expand the Leave Request Item View node down to the Leave Request Smart Object. Then drag the employee email into the employee email input property. Now let's switch over to the Output Mapping screen and map the return properties for the Leave Request List View display rows controls on the left side. From here, let's drag over Leave Request Title, Employee Name, both start and end date fields, the leave type, and the request status. That should just about do it, so you can click Finish when you're ready to close the configuration screen. However, do not exit the Rule Designer just yet. The last configuration is going to be to hide the Create button for the Approving Manager. With the Actions tab still highlighted, let's search on the keyword Hide. Then click on the action called Hide a View Control to add it to the Rule Definition pane. We will need to tell it which control and which view that control is in at this point, so click the Select View link and choose Leave Request Item View because that's where our Create button actually lives. Now, click the Select Control link and choose the Create button. That designates the control to hide on the form at this point, so you can click OK to close the Rule Designer when you're ready, and then click Finish to complete the rule configurations. Let's right-click on the Leave Request form over here and select Check-in. In this final step for creating our basic leave request application, we configure two actions for the workflow task state. This is the state that represents the Approving Manager user interface. First, we configured an action that will retrieve the originator's previous leave requests, and then we also hid the Create button from the manager as it is not needed. This completes the build-out of our leave request application. Let's move on to part 4 where we will test out the application to make sure that it works. In part 4, we will be working through step 12 to test the leave request application by submitting two leave request forms. To quickly set the context for our testing, after submitting two leave requests, we will use the link found in one of the task notification emails for the Approving Manager in their version of Outlook to open a work list item with our form and then action it as approved. We will then confirm that these two leave request records are appearing in the list with the correct status values down at the bottom of the page. One record should say submitted at this point and the other one should say approved. From K2 Designer, click to highlight the leave request form if you aren't already in it. Once it opens up to the Properties pane, take notice of the runtime URL that's available on the page. Now, if you don't see the properties here, you may need to click the little arrow icon in the top right of the panel that says Show Properties to expand the properties for the form. The runtime URL is the link to your form that you will want to push out or publish to your end users for production purposes so that they can submit their own forms. For testing and demonstration purposes, let's click the runtime URL link on this page right here. Depending on your environment, it may take a few seconds for the form to open. Okay, once the form opens, notice that we are in the form as we configured it in the leave request workflow state. It's ready to accept new leave requests with the current employee name and email fields filled out automatically for us. We have two views available. The top one is the item view and the bottom one is our list view. I don't have any requests out there yet for this account, so the list is empty for the time being. For the first request, I'm going to enter in leave request test 1 for the title. Notice that we have two calendar controls for the leave start and end dates. Go ahead and select any date range that you want with these, as they are pretty standard date picker controls. Then, using the drop-down list, select a leave type. Enter in a request or comment. Now, remember we put leave request status here at the bottom of this view. We can leave this alone as it is reserved for the workflow. This would typically be a read-only field in most scenarios, but for the sake of time, we just left it as it is. OK, click Create when you've filled out the form. Then you will be returned to the form as you left it. We didn't put any confirmation messages, form redirects, or rules to clear out the fields in a post-processing activity, so all you have to do for now is change the field values, in other words titles and dates, for the next leave request. We will add that functionality in during another course that extends this application, so for now I'll just set this one to Leave Request Test 2. I'll change the start and end dates. Switch the leave request type, and then update the comment a little bit. Click the Create button again. Once again, the form processes very quickly and you are returned to the form as you left it. If you did not receive any errors, you can go ahead and close the browser for this user. At this point, we need to do a little bit of setup by opening the Approving Manager's Outlook and an instance of Internet Explorer to confirm the task notification emails were received. Then we will action one of the tasks to make sure it follows the workflow path correctly. If you are working on a K2 provided virtual machine, you are more than likely logged in as the Denalix administrator. This account's assigned manager is actually Jono, so we need to open his Outlook client and an instance of Internet Explorer running as Jono for the next task. If you are building this application in your own environment, you will need to have access to the appropriate Outlook account of the manager for the user that submitted the leave request, or at least have access to the user you selected for the manager approval task when you design the workflow. If you are using a K2 provided virtual machine, go ahead and open the user shortcuts found in the lower right corner of the screen, and expand the Legal folder and select Jono's Explorer application first. This will automatically start Explorer as the user Jono for you. Now it may take a second or two for this to log in and run the application as him the first time. Once that loads, go back to the Shortcuts menu and load up Outlook for Jono as well. This may also take a minute or two when using a virtual machine environment. If this is the first time you've opened Jono's Outlook, you may see a message about synchronizing CRM data. If so, give it a minute or two to complete. Then, if you see a message about licensing, you can just close it and continue. Okay, now with Jono's Outlook instance, confirm that there are 2 task notification emails sitting in his inbox. It looks like we have those sitting there. I'll select the first email received. Notice in this message we have information about the task assignment in the subject and body. It also gives the user the ability to complete the task by replying to the message with the selected action in the first line of the body of the message. As I mentioned earlier, we can also include more descriptive information in the subject line and body of the message that can give the user more to go on for the task. In doing this, we can include data from SmartObject data sources as well as document attachments. We do walk through customizing the email notifications in various tutorials as you get more advanced in your training with K2. In this first email, I'll click to open the work list item from the link. Notice the workflow view that K2 has placed at the top of the form. I mentioned earlier that K2 does this for us at runtime automatically for user task assignments. This is the default panel that K2 adds when we workflow enabled the form by adding it to the manager approval task. The approver can select their decision from the drop-down list and then click the Submit button to complete the task. This workflow panel is not the only way to workflow enable forms. You can also define your own controls and rules to handle this task if you'd like, and we get into that with some of the more advanced tutorials if you'd like to continue on. Confirm that the leave request details are correct, and then confirm that both form submissions show up in the previous leave request view with the request status as submitted for the user that submitted the request. This looks pretty good, so I will action the request by selecting one of the action items. I'll go ahead and select Approved for this test, and then click Submit. This time you will receive K2's generic confirmation message on the form. Click OK to close the dialog and switch back over to Jono's Outlook client, but do not close his Internet Explorer. Let's open the second work list item from Jono's inbox. In the previous leave requests list down at the bottom, confirm that the request status value has now changed for the request that we just approved in the previous step. It looks like it was approved, so that will do it for our test. Feel free if you wish to go on and approve or reject this second leave request. Let's take a moment to review what we've learned. The exercises in the leave request basic application are meant to provide an introduction to building K2 applications and the K2 components of an application, those being data, forms, and workflows. By completing the 4 parts, you should have a basic understanding of how data, forms, and workflows integrate with each other and how rules can be implemented behind the scenes to provide dynamic functionality in your forms to enhance the experience for your users. Let's briefly talk about the elements that we've learned about. For our data element, smart objects are the connectors to your data sources, and they act as a bridge between those data sources and consumers of the data, being forms, workflows, reports, etc. We use SmartBox as a K2 provided storage mechanism for creating your own data source from scratch, and then to access the data in these underlying smart objects, we use methods that can be called from views, forms, and workflows. For example, getList. Now let's talk about forms a little bit. Forms are the containers for our views and controls, and remember, views are logical sections of form content, and we have 2 types of views, one being item views that contain the content for one record, and list views which contain multiple records. Behind these we have rules which are comprised of events, conditions, and actions. Events are when something occurs on the form or view, conditions can be applied if a specific criteria has been met, and actions do something behind the scenes if the event and condition has been met. Remember how we used states within our form? Rules can be applied to different workflow states, essentially creating custom forms for workflow events. And remember, as you work on forms and views, they must be checked in before they can be exposed to your users. Now let's briefly talk about workflows. In this exercise, when we break the workflow down, it was created in K2 Designer, and it was comprised of steps and events that were connected with outcome lines. And remember, we have 2 types of events in our workflows. First, we have system events, which are performed by the K2 server, such as sending an email or updating a smart object. Then we have user or client task events, which are tasks performed by a human, which involve making a decision to move the workflow on. As you build and design your workflows, remember that they must be deployed before they can be exposed to users. Thank you for watching this tutorial on building out the basic version of a leave request application. We hope you have a better understanding on how K2 can help you implement solutions like this in your organization. If you're ready, feel free to move on to the next tutorial in this series that will walk through extending this leave request application.